In Fargo, nothing seems to happen until one day, something does. A Fargo story. A crime that began quietly. The roads were quiet, the towns were small, and life moved slowly in the frozen Midwest. That's why, when something went wrong, it didn't explode. It lingered. This is a Fargo story, and like most of them, it began quietly. In Fargo, ordinary days have a way of blending into one another. The cold is not something people comment on anymore. It is simply there, shaping the rhythm of life, slowing movements, quieting streets. Mornings arrive without urgency, and routines unfold the same way they always have. It's a place where predictability feels natural, even reassuring. On this particular day, nothing stood out. There were no unusual calls, no disturbances, no sense that anything was about to shift. People left their homes bundled against the cold, started their cars, and followed familiar roads without giving the journey much thought. Workplaces opened, small conversations happened, and time moved forward in the quiet, unremarkable way Fargo was known for. In towns like this, the absence of chaos becomes its own kind of comfort. When days pass without incident, you stop anticipating disruption. Life feels contained, manageable, safely distant from the kinds of stories that make headlines elsewhere. Fargo was not supposed to be the setting for something dark. It was supposed to be a place where things stayed small and controlled. What makes days like this unsettling is not what happens during them, but how unremarkable they feel in hindsight. When investigators later tried to trace the beginning of everything that followed, they found no clear starting point. There was no dramatic argument, no visible warning sign, no single moment that stood out as the instant when things went wrong. Instead, there was only normalcy. A day that began exactly like the ones before it. A routine so familiar that no one thought to question it. And that sameness, that sense of safety, would later become part of the story itself. Because whatever happened next did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It emerged quietly, slipping into a day that had given no reason to expect it. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the ordinary day Fargo trusted had already passed. The first shift did not feel dramatic. In fact, at the time, it barely felt like anything at all. There was no moment that demanded attention, no clear signal that something irreversible had just begun. It was subtle, the kind of change that slips past unnoticed because it looks too ordinary to matter. It may have been a decision that seemed insignificant, or a routine that played out slightly differently than usual. Nothing that would have raised concern on its own. In Fargo, small deviations from routine were easy to dismiss. Weather changed plans. Time ran late. People adjusted and moved on without thinking twice. What makes moments like this difficult to recognize is how harmless they appear in isolation. When life is predictable, small changes don't register as threats. They blend into the background, absorbed by the steady rhythm of everyday life. No one pauses to ask whether this is the point they'll one day wish they could return to. Later, when timelines were reconstructed and events carefully reviewed, this moment would take on new meaning. Investigators would circle back to it, studying it closely, asking whether this was where everything quietly shifted. But at the time, there was no reason to stop, no reason to hesitate, no reason to believe the outcome would be anything other than ordinary. The people involved continued their day unaware that the path had subtly changed. What followed still felt controllable, still felt familiar. Fargo remained calm. The streets stayed quiet. and life moved forward as if nothing had been altered. That is how the most consequential changes often begin, not with chaos but with calm, not with warning but with routine. By the time the significance of the shift becomes clear, it no longer feels small at all, it feels permanent. And from that point on, the day was no longer just an ordinary day. It had crossed into something else, even if no one realized it yet. What followed was not something Fargo was prepared for, not because the act itself was unimaginable, but because it happened in a place where people believed distance alone was protection. Serious crimes were things that happened elsewhere, in bigger cities, louder places, far removed from quiet Midwestern towns like this one. At first, there was confusion. Information arrived in fragments, incomplete and often contradictory. What people thought they understood began to shift as details emerged, then shifted again as new facts replaced the old ones. Nothing fit together cleanly, and that uncertainty only deepened the shock. The reality of what had occurred settled slowly. It did not explode into the town's consciousness all at once. Instead, it crept in through conversations, phone calls, and unanswered questions. People replayed the ordinary moments of the day, searching for signs they might have missed, something that could explain how the unthinkable had managed to slip through unnoticed. For those closest to the situation, disbelief gave way to fear. The familiar suddenly felt fragile. Streets that once seemed safe now carried an unease that hadn't existed before. Fargo's quiet, once comforting, began to feel heavy, as if it were holding something it didn't know how to release. As the story spread, one question echoed repeatedly. How could this happen here? There was no easy answer. The details offered no comfort. Only the growing realization that the assumptions people relied on about safety, about normalcy, about distance from danger had been wrong. What no one saw coming wasn't just the event itself. It was the way it altered everything that followed, the way a single incident could fracture the sense of stability an entire community depended on. Fargo had crossed a line, even if no one yet understood where it led. And as the initial shock faded, another phase began, one marked not by answers but by uncertainty, by the need to understand what had happened and why. The search for clarity was just beginning. Why this was never officially called the Fargo case. Despite how often it would later be referred to as a Fargo case, that was never its official name. No police report used it. No court document recorded it that way. Fargo was not the headline. It was the setting, a quiet backdrop that shaped how the story unfolded and how people struggled to understand it. In the days that followed, what people knew came in pieces. Information surfaced slowly, unevenly, and sometimes incorrectly. Initial assumptions were made, then quietly revised. Timelines shifted as new details emerged, forcing investigators and the public alike to rethink what they believed had happened. The discovery itself did not bring clarity. Instead, it raised more questions. What was first noticed seemed small, almost incidental, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Phone calls were made, authorities were notified, and suddenly, the ordinary routines Fargo relied on were interrupted by uncertainty. As word spread, confusion deepened. Different accounts conflicted with one another. Times didn't align. Movements didn't make sense. What should have been straightforward became tangled, and the lack of clear answers unsettled everyone involved. In a town used to calm predictability, uncertainty felt invasive. For investigators, The challenge was immediate. Sorting fact from assumption proved difficult when so much of the early information was shaped by shock rather than certainty. People remembered moments differently. Ordinary interactions were re-examined, scrutinized for meaning they never seemed to carry before. And yet, even as questions multiplied, the town continued to refer to it in its own way, not by names or case numbers, but by place. The Fargo case. A shorthand born not from official records, but from the collective disbelief that something like this could happen here. That distinction mattered, because while reports and files worked toward precision, the people living through it were trying to make sense of something that felt fundamentally out of place. The confusion wasn't just about what had happened, it was about how reality itself had shifted without warning. As investigators worked to establish a clear timeline, one thing became certain. Whatever answers they were looking for would not come easily. The story was no longer just about an event. It was about reconstructing a moment when normal life quietly gave way to something far more complicated. And as the details continued to surface, Fargo found itself facing a truth it had never expected to confront. When the investigation began, it did so under a quiet but growing pressure. Fargo was not accustomed to this level of scrutiny. Law enforcement was used to routine matters, minor disputes, familiar faces, problems that rarely escalated beyond what could be resolved quickly. This was different. From the start, there was a sense that something larger was unfolding, even if its shape was still unclear. Officers began gathering what little information they had. Early reports were reviewed carefully, not because they were detailed, but because they were fragile. Small inconsistencies stood out. Times didn't fully align. Movements seemed ordinary, yet difficult to explain once placed under a microscope. Each piece of information raised the same question: what had been missed? In a small community, investigations move differently. People know one another. Histories overlap. Conversations carry weight beyond what is said out loud. That familiarity can be helpful, but it can also complicate things. Assumptions are harder to challenge when everyone believes they already understand the people involved. As investigators worked, they found themselves balancing urgency with restraint. There was pressure to act quickly, but also an understanding that rushing could lead to mistakes. Every step had to be measured, every detail documented. Fargo was watching, quietly, closely, even as it tried to carry on as normal. The absence of immediate answers only intensified the tension. Leads were followed, then quietly abandoned. Some details appeared promising at first, only to lose significance under closer examination. Others lingered, unresolved, refusing to fit neatly into the developing narrative. What troubled investigators most was not what they knew, but what they didn't. Gaps in the timeline refused to close. Certain actions made sense on their own, but not when viewed together. The picture remained incomplete, and that incompleteness suggested intention rather than accident. As days passed, the investigation expanded. More people were interviewed, more questions were asked, and with each answer came the possibility of another contradiction. Fargo's calm exterior remained intact, but beneath it, something had shifted. Trust in routine had been replaced by caution. This was no longer just about finding answers. It was about understanding how a place built on predictability could suddenly feel unstable. The investigation had begun, but it was already clear that uncovering the truth would require patience and a willingness to question everything that once seemed obvious. As the investigation moved forward, certain details began to resist explanation. On their own, they seemed minor, easy to overlook, easy to rationalize. But when placed side by side, they refused to align. The more investigators reviewed the timeline, the more apparent it became that something was off. Statements that initially appeared consistent began to fracture under closer examination. Small differences in wording, subtle changes in recollection, moments that were remembered differently depending on who was asked. None of it was enough to point to a clear conclusion, but together it created unease. In cases like this, discomfort often arrives long before certainty. There were actions that made sense individually, but not collectively. Movements that seemed ordinary until they were placed within the broader sequence of events. Decisions that, in hindsight, felt unnecessary or strangely timed. Investigators noted these moments carefully, aware that the truth often hides in what doesn't immediately stand out. In Fargo, this process unfolded quietly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public declarations. Instead, questions were asked again and again, each time framed slightly differently. The goal was not to accuse, but to understand. Still, the repetition itself carried weight. When answers shift under pressure, it suggests more than faulty memory. What complicated matters further was the environment itself. Familiarity blurred judgment. In a small town, people are often given the benefit of the doubt. Patterns of behavior are explained away as personality, routine, or coincidence. Investigators had to work against that instinct, reminding themselves that closeness can conceal as much as it reveals. As days passed, certain details refused to disappear. They resurfaced during interviews, appeared in reports, and lingered in the minds of those working the case. Each inconsistency added strain to a narrative that no longer held together cleanly. The story investigators wanted to believe, the simplest one, began to feel less convincing. At this stage, the case did not yet have a clear direction. There were no definitive answers, only fragments. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the sense that these fragments were connected. The challenge was determining how and whether the connection was intentional. In the investigations like this, realization does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly through repetition, through doubt, through the growing awareness that the truth may be more uncomfortable than anyone initially expected. Fargo had reached that point. The details no longer fit, and the space between them was beginning to speak. As uncertainty persisted, attention began to spread beyond the immediate circle of investigators. What had once been a quiet internal matter slowly entered the public sphere. Questions that had been asked behind closed doors were now being repeated more openly and with greater urgency. Fargo was no longer processing the situation alone. Media interest arrived cautiously at first. Short reports, limited details, careful language. But even restrained coverage had an effect. In a town unaccustomed to scrutiny, the presence of cameras and reporters altered the atmosphere. Familiar places suddenly felt exposed, as though ordinary life were being observed from a distance. With coverage came pressure. The absence of clear answers invited speculation, and speculation rarely remains contained. Rumors circulated quietly, then more freely. People began to talk, not loudly, but persistently. Conversation shifted from curiosity to concern, from concern to suspicion. The story was no longer just about what had happened, but about who might be involved. For those connected to the case, the weight of attention was immediate. Every movement, every word carried new significance. Privacy became difficult to maintain, and silence was often interpreted as something more than restraint. In small communities, attention doesn't disperse easily. It lingers. Investigators felt the pressure as well. Public interest brought expectations for progress, for clarity, for resolution. Each day without answers intensified the sense that time was working against them. Yet moving too quickly risked mistakes, and mistakes in cases like this could not be undone. The town itself began to change under the strain. The quiet that once felt comforting now carried tension. People became more guarded. Familiar routines continued, but with an awareness that something was unresolved. Fargo was still calm on the surface, but beneath it, the story had begun to take shape in ways no one could fully control. Media coverage did more than inform, it amplified. It connected isolated doubts, giving them form and momentum. What had once been fragments of concern were now part of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond Fargo's borders. And with that expansion came a shift. The case was no longer just local. As attention intensified, so did the need for a turning point, something that could move the story forward, break the stalemate, and provide direction. The pressure was building, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the investigation could not remain in limbo much longer. The question was no longer whether the story would change, but how. The turning point did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with hesitation. A detail that had once seemed peripheral began to demand attention, refusing to remain in the background. Investigators returned to it not because they were confident, but because they were running out of places to look. What shifted the investigation was not a single dramatic revelation, but a gradual realignment of focus. A timeline was revisited. A statement was reconsidered. A sequence of events that had previously seemed disjointed began to suggest a different order, one that changed how everything else was understood. As this new perspective took shape, earlier assumptions began to unravel. Actions that had once been dismissed as coincidence now appeared deliberate. Gaps that investigators had struggled to explain suddenly felt intentional rather than accidental. The case did not become simpler, but it became clearer in its complexity. This moment marked a change not just in direction, but in tone. The investigation grew more precise, more deliberate. Questions were no longer broad or exploratory. They narrowed. Focus shifted from possibilities to probabilities, from what might have happened to what most likely did. For those involved, the shift was unsettling. The sense of distance that had once existed between suspicion and certainty began to shrink. Silence took on new meaning. Familiar explanations no longer held the same weight. Fargo's quiet once again became heavy, but now it felt charged rather than empty. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified. Decisions had to be made carefully, knowing that the consequences would be lasting. Investigators understood that from this point forward, every move would shape the outcome of the case. There was no returning to ambiguity. The turning point did not resolve the story. It reframed it. It offered a path forward, even if that path led somewhere uncomfortable. And as the investigation followed this new direction, one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever the truth was, it would not allow Fargo to return to the way things had been. The case had crossed another threshold, and from here on, the consequences would be unavoidable. Once the direction of the investigation became clear, the consequences followed quietly but decisively. There were no sudden announcements, no public spectacle. Instead, events unfolded with the controlled gravity of a process that had already moved beyond doubt. Decisions were made behind closed doors, guided by evidence rather than speculation. When action was finally taken, It carried weight far beyond the individuals directly involved. Arrests and legal proceedings did not bring immediate relief or clarity. Instead, they introduced a different kind of tension, one shaped by permanence. From that point on, nothing could be undone. Lives were no longer defined by routine, but by records, dates, and irreversible outcomes. For those closest to the case, the impact was immediate and deeply personal. Normal life fractured under the weight of public scrutiny and private reckoning. Relationships were altered, trust eroded, and familiar spaces took on new meanings. Fargo's quiet streets remained unchanged, but the people moving through them were not. The legal process moved forward methodically. Charges were filed, hearings were scheduled. Each step carried its own significance, even when progress felt slow. In cases like this, justice does not arrive all at once. It accumulates through paperwork, testimony, and decisions that reshape futures one ruling at a time. What made this stage particularly difficult was the absence of closure. Legal outcomes rarely provide emotional resolution. They establish responsibility, but they cannot restore what was lost. For some, the process offered a sense of accountability. For others, it raised new questions about motive, about timing, about whether the truth had been fully uncovered. As the case advanced through the system, Fargo began to settle into a new reality. The intensity of attention faded, replaced by a quieter aftermath. But the weight of what had happened did not disappear. It lingered in conversations that stopped short, in places that were avoided, in memories that refused to soften with time. Consequences are not always loud. Often they are carried silently long after the headlines move on. In Fargo, the outcome of the case marked an end, but it also marked a beginning. A shift in how people understood safety, familiarity, and the assumptions they once relied on without question. And as the legal chapter drew toward its conclusion, one thing became clear. The story was no longer confined to the courtroom. Its impact extended far beyond verdicts and sentences, reaching into the lives left behind. For those closest to what had happened, the case was never just a sequence of events or legal steps. It was the slow realization that life would now be divided into before and after. Ordinary moments, mornings, conversations, familiar places, no longer carried the same weight they once did. While the investigation focused on facts and timelines, families were left to navigate a different reality, one shaped by absence, unanswered questions, and the quiet work of learning how to exist alongside loss. There were no clear instructions for this part, no resolution that could restore what had been taken. In Fargo, grief did not announce itself loudly. It settled in private spaces, in empty rooms, in routines that continued out of necessity rather than comfort. For those living with the aftermath, the case never truly ended. It simply moved into a form that could not be documented or closed. And it was this invisible impact, carried long after the legal process concluded, that would define how the story was remembered. After the case moved out of the headlines, Fargo slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Streets remained quiet. Winters came and went. From the outside, very little appeared to have changed, but the calm that settled back over the town was not the same calm that had existed before. For those who lived through it, the story never fully receded into the past. Certain places carried new meanings. Certain dates were remembered differently. Even silence felt altered, no longer empty, but layered with memory. Fargo had absorbed the event into its landscape, just as it had absorbed the cold for generations. Time did what it always does. It softened some edges while leaving others sharp. Conversations became less frequent, details less precise, but the core of the story remained intact, passed quietly from one person to another, not as a warning shouted aloud, but as a shared understanding that something had once shifted here. What lingered most was not the crime itself, but the realization it brought. That distance does not guarantee safety. That familiarity can disguise risk. That even the quietest places are not immune to moments that change everything. Fargo had learned this not through chaos, but through disruption that arrived without warning. In official records, the case would always exist as a file, categorized, dated, closed. But in the collective memory of the town, it lived differently. It lived as a moment when ordinary life fractured and the assumptions people relied on no longer held. This is why the story continues to be remembered the way it is, not because of its name or its details, but because of where it happened and how quietly it began. Fargo did not become something else after this. It remained what it had always been. But those who remembered understood that the silence now carried weight. Stories like this do not demand to be retold. They persist on their own, resurfacing in reflection, in caution, in the spaces between what is said and what is remembered. The case would ultimately move through the legal system, leaving behind formal conclusions, even if emotional closure never fully arrived. Because stories don't end, they echo. In the end, Fargo did not become a different place. The streets remained quiet. The cold returned, just as it always had. But the silence carried something new. This story was not about a single case. It was about a place, and how often ordinary life there fractured without warning. In Fargo, these stories did not arrive loudly. They came quietly, one by one, and each of them left an echo. Because stories don't end, they echo. Next on True Echoes. One case would force Fargo to confront its silence: the murder of Bruce Blackman, 1991. The first case that shattered Fargo's sense of safety. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. What stayed with you most about this Fargo story? Do you think quiet places are truly safer, or just quieter about what they hide? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk. Stories don't end, they echo. And step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.